Welcome to this gun legislation town hall meeting, hosted by Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence and Organizing for Action.
We at Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence are very, very pleased and thrilled about the Governor's Gun Violence Prevention Act, the Firearms Safety Act of 2013, and Senator Brian Frosch and Senator Ron Young had a lot to do with getting it enacted. Senator Frosch was the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee and really did a masterful job of explaining the bill first to his committee and then to the full Senate. And we're thrilled to be here today to talk with you about what's in the bill and why it's a great life-saving measure. There are 6 or 7 key elements to the bill, and I'm going to list them all and then talk about them in a little bit more detail. In my view, the most important part of this law is a measure requiring handgun purchasers, not owners, but handgun purchasers, to get a license from the state police before they can purchase a handgun and get a fingerprint-based background check before they can get it. And in the back is a document just recently prepared by experts at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins Center on Gun Policy and Research, which describes the importance of the fingerprint licensing provision. The elements of the law are, and Lisa put together a nice summary of some of them. One is the fingerprint licensing, which we'll talk about a little more. Another, something that Senator Frosch has worked on for many, many years, which is very important, which is better state regulation of gun dealers. Gun dealers are regulated at the federal and state level, but before this law takes effect, only the federal government could close down a dealer who's really doing a bad job and getting a lot of guns getting into the hands of criminals. Most dealers are decent people and do fine, but a small minority of dealers are responsible for a lot of guns getting in the hands of criminals. And before this law, only the federal government could do something about it, and they don't have the resources. So under this law that Senator Frosch has really been the main person getting enacted, the state can regulate gun dealers in a better way. So that's going to help save lives. That's number 2. Number 3 is a simple law saying that if your gun is lost or stolen, you need to report it to the police within 72 hours. And that was put in by Delegate Luke Clippinger of Baltimore City, Senator Jamie Raskin from Montgomery County. And that's a very important provision that, because sometimes people will not, someone will have a gun and give it to someone who shouldn't have it and then say, well, it was lost or stolen. We don't want people to do that. So when the gun is lost or stolen, you report it. That way, these giving of guns to criminals is less likely to happen. A third is something that was proposed by Delegate Kiefer Mitchell in Baltimore City, strictly making penalties for use of Teflon-coated cop killer bullets. I think nobody objected to that. That was a very good provision. A fourth provision by Delegate Louise Simmons of Montgomery County provides that if you get a probation before judgment for a very bad violent crime, you should be prohibited from getting a gun. And I think that's very reasonable, because we don't want people who are more likely to use the guns in crime to shoot somebody to get a gun. So that's also in it. And a measure prohibiting the sale of assault rifles. Rifles like the ones used in Newtown and Aurora to kill so many people. And a measure, very, very important, to prohibit the sale in Maryland of magazines that can shoot more than 10 bullets at one time. And those are the key elements of the bill. And if I left anything out, one of the senators can help me out. But those are the key elements of the provision of this measure. And together, this law has the components that will save lives in Maryland. Each of these measures is science-based and was strongly supported by top law enforcement officers from around the state who came to Maryland and said, we need these measures to help us protect Maryland citizens. And it was also supported by the vast majority of Maryland citizens. According to a poll conducted by Goucher, over 80% of Marylanders support the fingerprint licensing provision of this law, including 68% of gun owners. 68% of gun owners, according to this independent poll by Goucher College, supported the fingerprint licensing of handgun purchasers. And the support included the faith community, the ecumenical leaders group that included the Catholics, all the Protestant denominations, major Jewish groups, Sikhs, Hindus, faith groups from all across the state endorsed this. The NAACP endorsed it, as I said, most law enforcement leaders. So it was really a broad array of Marylanders from one end of the state to the other who said, we need this law in order to protect our citizens. So those are the major elements, but I want to talk most particularly about the fingerprint licensing. We'll talk more about the federal situation a little later, as Lisa says, but Maryland has done a lot over the last few years to reduce gun violence. And one of the main things we've done, which puts us ahead of most states, is expand background checks to all sales. Background checks are critical to keeping guns out of the wrong hands. The history is, before 1968, there were no limits really on who could buy a handgun. In 1968, spurred by the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, this 1968 gun law was enacted, gun control law, and that law prohibits people convicted of violent crimes from getting guns. And everybody agrees with that now. That is basic law. People, and the data shows that the most likely people to use a gun to kill are people who have committed violent crimes. The problem was, after the law was passed, nobody was checking to see in many states. Some states, like Maryland, have had checks, background checks at gun stores to make sure these people didn't get guns for years. Since the 1960s, we've had that. But most states did not. It was not until the Brady Law of 1993, named after Jim Brady, Ronald Reagan's press secretary, who was sadly shot along with Ronald Reagan in 1981. It was not until that law was passed that required gun dealers across the country to get a background check from someone before they gave them a gun. Under that law, millions of people have been stopped from getting handguns who shouldn't get them. In other words, criminals were going into gun stores, wanting to buy handguns, but because of the Brady Law, they were stopped. And that has saved many, many lives. Unfortunately, there was a big loophole in the National Brady Law. It didn't apply to gun shows or commercial sales, just gun stores. Luckily, Maryland in the early 90s passed laws under Governor Schaefer and Governor Glendening that closed the gun show loophole and provided for universal background checks. So in Maryland, background checks apply to all gun sales, whether it's at a gun store or a gun show or between individuals. We'll talk more about how that can happen at the federal level, but Maryland has had universal background checks since the early 90s, and that has saved many lives. There are, however, two main problems with background checks, two main loopholes in it. One is criminals lying about who they are. And they will sometimes go into a gun store or to a gun show with a fake ID, lie about who they are, and get a gun when they shouldn't get one. And the other big loophole is what's called straw purchases, when a criminal asks someone who's not a criminal, who has a clean record, to go in get a gun for them. Those loopholes are major problems that needed to be closed, and that's what this law does. It addresses those two loopholes, and this document explains very carefully how that happens. So now, as of October 1, 2013, it will no longer be possible for a criminal to lie about who he or she is in order to get a gun. They will be fingerprinted, so we'll know for sure they shouldn't get a gun, they will be stopped. Secondly, if you are asked, you're not a criminal, and you're asked by a criminal to get a gun for them, a handgun for them, you're very unlikely to do it after October 1, 2013, when you have to go to the state police and be fingerprinted. You're just not likely to do it. And the facts support that. The states that have fingerprint-based licensing, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, and Hawaii, have dramatically lower gun death rates than states that don't. It works. One state, Missouri, and this is documented on this piece of paper, had fingerprint licensing until 2007. They repealed it. Gun deaths went up in their state while they went down everywhere else. The fact is, take New York City, for example. In New York City, which has lower gun death rates than Baltimore and states that don't have handgun licensing, the guns used in crime, 85% of the guns used in crime come from out of state. People in New York just don't go buy a gun for a criminal in New York or New Jersey because of the fingerprint licensing. A New Jersey State Police official told a Maryland reporter from the Maryland Gazette, we in New Jersey don't have straw purchases because of our fingerprint licensing. In Maryland, on the other hand, today, 60 or 70% of our gun deaths, guns used in crime, come from in-state through straw purchases and people lying about who they are. This law will close both those loopholes and will save many lives. So, in conclusion, this law is a lifesaver, and I'm very happy that the plan, there was an announcement a couple weeks ago by the NRA that they're not planning to take the law to referendum. That's good. That means it will take effect October 1 and start saving laws then. There are people who are planning to challenge it in court. I believe it will be upheld and is constitutional. This law does not infringe upon Second Amendment rights at all. It's fully within what the Supreme Court ruled in the Heller decision, and it really, because if you own a gun, you don't even have to go get a license. You only have to get a license if you go to purchase a gun, and New Jersey has had that since 1966, and gun owners are not objecting. Because it makes sense. The Supreme Court says states can enact these kind of laws in order to protect our citizens. So we are fully confident that the courts will uphold it. It will take effect October 1, and it will save many lives. So thank you very much.
What's left to say? There's not much left to say. Vinny gave a great explanation of what's in the bill and a great explanation of why it's in the bill. But let me give you a couple of more concrete examples. And first, with respect to gun dealers. As you know, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the federal agency, has not had a permanent full-time chief since President Obama was elected. The Senate has not been willing to confirm anybody to be the full-time head of the ATF. And the ATF has not done a good job of regulating gun dealers in this country. We know that 1% of the gun dealers account for about 60% of the guns that are used in crimes. We know that it takes the ATF 5 to 6 years to get around to looking at gun stores to see whether their inventory is what it's supposed to be and whether they're selling to people who are qualified to purchase firearms. We have a poster child for the gun dealer regulation piece of this bill in Maryland. And that poster child was a store called Valley Guns in Baltimore County. Valley Guns was cited by the ATF for 900 violations of federal law. Yet, it took the ATF nearly 10 years to put them out of business. During that period of time, Valley Guns couldn't account for 25% of their inventory. Didn't know what happened to it, they said. It was more than 400 guns. And if you can imagine what would happen with CVS or Best Buy or Safeway, if they said, you know, just don't know what happened to those bananas or those television sets or those vitamins, you know, they'd be out of business in a heartbeat. The reason Valley Guns couldn't account for 25% of their inventory is because they were selling them to criminals. And more than 500 of the guns that were sold by that shop that were in its inventory turned up in crimes. When the ATF finally got to the point that they suspended the license of Valley Guns, the owner took the business and turned it over to his mother. He stood behind the cash register. He sold the guns. He got a salary from it, but he said, it's my mom that's really running this place now. And it took the ATF another 2 years to get that license revoked. So in our bill, we say that the state police have the authority to revoke or suspend the license of gun dealers that don't follow the law, that can't account for the guns in their stores. And we know that if gun stores will stop selling guns to criminals, it'll reduce crime, it'll save lives. The other provision, and I think this is obvious, but the other provision that Vinny mentioned that I think is very important. They're all very important, but Vinny emphasized licensing. So let me just talk to you for a moment about the 10-round magazine limit. And I'll just give you one example of the importance of that. In Tucson, Arizona, when the shooter attempted to assassinate Gabrielle Giffords, he had a Glock 19 pistol. It had 33 rounds in the magazine. The first round he shot into Congresswoman Giffords' head. The next 32 rounds each inflicted a wound. Every single one of them. A bunch of people died. The 13th round hit a 9-year-old girl, Christina Taylor Green, and killed her. When he had expended the 33rd bullet from that Glock 19, he ejected it, went to slip another 33-round magazine into his gun so he could keep shooting. And a woman managed to tackle him. She wasn't able to knock him down, but she was able to knock the magazine out of his hand. It only takes a couple of seconds to switch magazines. But this woman knocked the magazine out of his hand, and he was then tackled by a bunch of other people in the audience. If he had had a 10-round magazine instead of a 33-round magazine, Christina Taylor Green would be alive today, as would a number of other people. I think it's just common sense.
I've read the Constitution many times. I've also read Judge Scalia's opinion, and I think in no way does this violate the Second Amendment. I support the Constitution, and I support all 10 amendments. And as I said, I don't think in any way it violates those amendments. Actually, on the magazine size, I supported reducing that, but actually a few hunters that stopped in my office even convinced me farther. We had a discussion, and one of them finally said, you know, I can bring a deer down with one bullet. There are rare occasions it takes two. If it takes more than that, he said, I shouldn't even be out there. And if you can bring down the animal, if you're hunting or whatever, with a bullet or two, what's the purpose of having that large magazine except for what it can do? We've come a long way since the Second Amendment was written. Back then there was no standing army, and everyone, they wanted every man at that time to own a gun, so that if they had to call a militia together, they'd come armed because the government couldn't afford to buy it. I think there was no recognition of the type of guns and things that we're going to have today. Another discussion I had in my office, where the gentleman was critical of this, I said, okay, I'll buy your argument. Can I have a tank and a rocket launcher in my backyard? He said, that's ridiculous. I said, can I have a nuclear weapon? He said, that's even more ridiculous. And I said, I agree with you. I said, I agree with you. Where do you draw the line? And I think that this reasonably draws a line.